For years, the world laughed with Jim Carrey. His energy felt endless, his smile almost unreal. But behind the humor, there was always a quiet question. How does someone who brings so much joy to others carry their own pain? Now, at 61, something has shifted. The laughter is still there, but softer. The spotlight feels different, and the man behind the characters is finally speaking in a way he never has before. What he reveals is not shocking in the usual sense. It's something deeper, something many people quietly suspected, but never fully understood. And once you see it, it changes everything. Long before the world knew the name Jim Carrey, there was a quiet boy growing up in Canada, learning how to survive in ways most people could not see. His childhood was not defined by comfort or certainty. Instead, it was shaped by financial struggle, sudden change, and a constant sense of instability that lingered in the background of everyday life. His father, a talented musician with unrealized dreams, made a difficult decision to trade passion for security. He took a steady job to provide for the family, setting aside his own ambitions. For young Jim, this was more than just a practical choice. It was a quiet lesson about fear, risk, and the cost of giving up what you love. It planted a question deep in his mind. Is safety worth the loss of self? Inside the home, tension could appear without warning, and Jim learned to notice it. He became observant, sensitive to mood, aware of emotional shifts before they were spoken. In those moments, he discovered something powerful. He could interrupt the heaviness. With exaggerated faces, quick impressions, and bursts of energy, he could make people laugh. And when they laughed, everything changed, even if only for a moment. But over time, this gift became something else. It was no longer just expression, it was expectation. The role followed him everywhere, until the line between performance and identity began to fade. If laughter became the only way to feel safe, what would happen when it could no longer protect him? As Jim Carrey stepped into the world of stand-up comedy, something clicked almost instantly. The stage gave him space to move, to stretch, to become something bigger than himself. His performances were not quiet or controlled. They were explosive. His face shifted in seconds, his body moved like elastic, and his voice carried a kind of urgency that audiences couldn't ignore. People didn't just laugh, they reacted. They leaned forward. They watched closely, unsure of what he might do next. That unpredictability became his signature, and soon, it opened doors. Hollywood quickly took notice. Films like Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, and The Mask didn't just make him famous. They made him unforgettable. Almost overnight, he became a global figure, someone audiences expected to deliver joy every time he appeared. But success brought a quieter pressure. The laughter was no longer spontaneous. It was expected. Every interview, every public moment carried the same unspoken rule: be the version of Jim people recognize. Behind the scenes, this expectation began to settle into his identity. The characters he played were bold and exaggerated, but they also became a kind of protection. They allowed him to stay visible while remaining hidden. And somewhere within that constant performance, a question began to grow. If the world only sees the act, where does the real self go? As the world embraced Jim Carrey the entertainer, was there anything left untouched behind the mask? At the height of his success, when the world saw only momentum and achievement, something quieter began to take shape in the life of Jim Carrey. It wasn't loud or sudden. It didn't interrupt his career in obvious ways. Instead, it appeared as something unfamiliar: silence. From the outside, everything seemed complete. Fame, recognition, and financial security had all been achieved. But internally, the experience felt different. The energy that once came so naturally began to shift. The laughter was still there, but it no longer carried the same ease. It started to feel distant, as if it belonged to someone else. This change did not happen overnight. It built slowly, shaped by years of constant performance and the pressure to remain on at all times. The identity he had created, and that the world had embraced, left little room for stillness. And without stillness, there was little space to process what he was feeling. Carrey began to step back, not in a dramatic way, but in small, noticeable shifts. Fewer roles, quieter appearances, a different tone in interviews. Audiences sensed the change, even if they couldn't explain it. What made this moment significant was his response. Instead of hiding it, he began to speak openly about his struggles with depression, not as a performance, but as a truth. If stepping back revealed a deeper emptiness, what path could lead him towards something more real? As Jim Carrey began to step further away from the constant noise of fame, a different kind of journey quietly took shape. It was no longer about performance or recognition. It was about understanding. In interviews, his tone shifted. The fast-talking humor softened into something slower, more reflective. He began speaking about identity, not as something fixed, but as something constructed. He questioned the idea of the self, suggesting that the version people see is often shaped by expectation rather than truth. These reflections were not rehearsed or polished. They felt personal, almost like thoughts spoken out loud. He explored the role of ego, the pressure to be someone, and how easily that idea can take over a person's life. For years, he had lived inside a version of himself that the world celebrated. Now, he was asking what existed beyond it. During this time, he turned to painting. Art became a quiet outlet, one that did not require laughter, timing, or approval. Through color and form, he expressed emotions that were difficult to explain. It gave him space to feel without performing. This transformation did not happen all at once. It unfolded slowly, with moments of clarity followed by uncertainty. But through it, something became clear. He was no longer trying to meet expectations. He was trying to understand himself. As the familiar identity began to fade, what truth was waiting beneath it? At 61, Jim Carrey began to speak with a tone that felt noticeably different. The energy that once filled every space was still present, but it no longer led the conversation. In its place was something quieter, stillness, reflection, and a kind of honesty that did not need to impress. There was less urgency to entertain, fewer exaggerated expressions, more pauses, and within those pauses, something important emerged. He began to openly describe the idea that Jim Carrey, as the world knew him, was not a fixed identity but a creation. A role shaped over time by circumstance, expectation. A role shaped over time by circumstance, expectation, and the need to navigate both struggle and success. It was not false, but it was incomplete. What made this realization powerful was the way he expressed it. There was no dramatic confession, no attempt to shock or redefine his image overnight. Instead, there was a calm acceptance. He acknowledged the joy his work had brought to millions, while also recognizing the personal cost of constantly living within a performance. This moment was not about regret. It was about awareness. The understanding that a person can outgrow the version of themselves they once needed to survive. And in that awareness, there was both freedom and uncertainty. If the identity he carried for so long was only part of the truth, what happens when he finally chooses to let it go? In recent years, Jim Carrey began to speak about his career in a way that felt final, but not heavy. There was no frustration in his words, no sense of loss. Instead, there was a quiet feeling of completion, as if a long chapter of his life had naturally reached its end. He described a sense that he had done what he came to do. The roles, the performances, the impact, he had given them his full energy. And now, there was no urgency to continue. This perspective stood in contrast to an industry that often values staying visible at all costs. For many, this decision was surprising. Walking away from the spotlight is rare, especially at a level of success he had achieved. But for Carrey, it did not feel like walking away. It felt like moving forward. The need for validation had softened. The pressure to prove something, whether to the world or to himself, no longer held the same weight. What replaced it was something quieter, acceptance. This moment reflects a different kind of success, one not defined by applause or recognition, but by a sense of inner calm, a willingness to step back and simply exist without expectation. When the performance finally ends, what remains? And who is he without the spotlight? Looking back at the life and career of Jim Carrey, a pattern begins to emerge, one that was always there, just beneath the surface. The humor, the energy, the unforgettable performances were real. They were not an illusion, but they were also part of something deeper, something more personal. Audiences around the world connected with him in a way that went beyond laughter. There was a feeling they couldn't quite explain. Beneath the exaggerated expressions and fast-moving comedy, there was a quiet vulnerability, a sense that the person making them laugh was also carrying something unseen. At the time, it was easy to overlook. Success tends to simplify people. It turns them into symbols of joy, of talent, of entertainment. But symbols often hide complexity. Now, at 61, that unspoken truth has slowly come into focus. Not through one defining moment, but through years of reflection, honesty, and change. Carrey did not suddenly reveal something new. Instead, he gave language to something that had always existed. His journey is not about losing himself in fame. It is about rediscovering who he was beneath it, about recognizing that the roles he played were only one part of a much larger identity. And in that realization, his story becomes something more universal. If so many people quietly sense this truth, how many others are still living behind a version of themselves they feel expected to be? Today, Jim Carrey stands in a place that feels very different from where his journey began. The urgency to become someone has softened. The need to prove, to perform, to be constantly seen, it no longer defines him in the same way. What remains is something quieter, but more grounded: reflection. There is no dramatic ending to his story, no final curtain call that neatly closes everything. Instead, there is a sense of continuation, a life still unfolding, but at a different pace. One that allows space for thought, for stillness, for simply being. His journey offers a subtle but powerful reminder. Identity is not something fixed or permanent. It evolves, often shaped by experience, pressure, and expectation. And even after reaching extraordinary success, there is still room to step back and ask deeper questions. For those watching, his story leaves behind more than admiration. It creates recognition, a quiet understanding that behind every public image, there's a private reality that may never be fully seen or understood. Carrey's life does not end with clear answers. Instead, it opens a door to awareness, to reflection, to possibility. If letting go reveals who we truly are, what might we discover if we allowed ourselves to do the same?